They shoved the orphan girl into the center of the market square and emptied a basket of cold ash over her head. "Thief's daughter!" 500 voices screamed as one, and even the children threw rotten yams at the girl, who had never stolen anything in her life. She knelt in the filth and said nothing. Because in 18 years, no one had ever once asked if the story they spat at her was even true. But high above the crowd, the most powerful woman in the kingdom watched from her shaded chair and smiled, because she alone knew the secret buried under the richest valley in the land, a secret she had killed an honest man to keep. What she did not know was that in 3 days, the crown prince of the whole kingdom would walk past every noble woman's daughter, kneel in the red dust before this same ash-covered girl, and take her hand before 10,000 stunned faces. And when he asked one simple question, "What is your name?" the answer would drag a dead man out of his grave, tear the mask off a great house, and shake the throne of Amuagu to its roots. But to understand how a girl the whole world threw away brought the mightiest woman in the kingdom to her knees, you must go back to the morning it all began. Her name was Nika, in the kingdom of Amuagu, where the red earth cracked under the dry season's sun, and a great silk cotton tree stood guard over the market square. Everyone knew her, and everyone had decided long ago that she was filth. She was 18 years old, an orphan, and the people of her village had a name they spat at her back as she passed. The thief's daughter. The morning smelled of dust and wood smoke and the sour of spilled palm wine when Nika carried her bundle of firewood across the square, the rough bark biting into her bare shoulder. Women turned their backs as she came near. A boy spat at her feet and laughed, and no one rebuked him. She said nothing, and she did not slow her step, because she had learned that in Amuagu, her silence was the one dignity no one had yet found a way to take from her. They said her father, Ikena, had been a thief who stole from the great Lady Adaku and died in disgrace, and that her mother had withered away from the shame of it. So the village had decided the rot lived in the blood, and for as long as Nika could remember, they had made her pay for a crime she had never seen and could not even name. Then the king's drums began to speak across the 7 quarters. A royal herald rode into the square upon a roan horse, and his voice rang out over the gathering crowd like struck bronze. "Hear the word of the palace. In 3 days Crown Prince Obiora will choose his bride before the whole kingdom. Every daughter of Amuagu is summoned to the festival." The square erupted with joy. Mothers seized their daughters by the wrists, and when Nika, forgetting herself for the space of a single breath, took one step toward the herald, a hard hand shoved her back into the dust. "Not you, thief's daughter," a woman hissed down at her. "You will carry the water and keep your cursed face to the ground." Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? To understand the storm that was gathering, you must first understand the prince at the heart of it. Crown Prince Obiora was the only living son of Izonwoha, the aging king, and he had been born into more wealth than the daughters of the village could imagine in a lifetime of imagining. His father's palace rose behind walls of carved red clay, and within them stood storehouses heavy with yam and bronze, herds of longhorned cattle that wandered to the edge of the sky, and a courtyard where servants moved from dawn to dusk like a slow and patient river. When Obiora rode out, the dust of 40 horsemen rose behind him, and the whole kingdom bowed its head when his shadow crossed the road. But a crown is a cold thing to hold on a lonely night, and Obiora was a man with a wound that no storehouse could fill. His mother, the gentle queen, had died when he was still a boy, and in the long years since, he had watched everyone around him smile at him with hunger behind their teeth. They did not love him. They loved the stool he would one day sit upon. The loudest of them all was Lady Adaku, the most powerful noblewoman in the kingdom, who pushed her glittering daughter Chinaza before the prince at every feast and called it devotion. He had grown so tired of being wanted by people who had never once asked who he truly was. "They do not want me, father," he said one evening, in the quiet after the lamps were lit. "They want the stool I will sit on," and they would smile the same smile at any man who sat there. Now turn your eyes back to Nika, in her small leaning hut at the broken edge of the village, where the thatch let in the rain and the floor was bare, swept earth. She owned a single good wrapper, washed so many times its color had faded to the memory of a color. And beneath her sleeping mat she kept the only treasure she had in this world. Her father's carved walking staff, snapped in two, its handle marked with the little leaping fish that had been Ikena's own sign. She worked from before the first cockerel until long after the stars came out, fetching water, grinding cassava, cleaning the compounds of women who paid her in scraps and insults. And though the whole world swore her father had been a thief, in her heart she had never once believed it. That was the truest thing about her. She would not lie, even when a lie would have softened a blow, and she would not curse her father's memory, even when honoring it cost her bread. But there was an old man in Umuagu who could not meet her eyes. Panusu, the palm wine tapper, who had once worked Ikena's fields, would look at Nika and his face would crumble like dry earth. One dusk, as she passed his stand, he caught her wrist and whispered, "Your father was no thief, child. God forgive me. Your father was no thief." Then he trembled and let her go, and hurried away into the falling dark, and would say no more. And though Nika did not understand it, the old people of the village still sometimes called the richest valley in the kingdom, the Green Ogbala Valley, where Lady Adaku's yams grew tallest, by an older name. They called it Ikena's Valley. But no one would ever say why. The day of the festival came hot and golden, and the whole kingdom poured through the palace gates. Drummers beat the red earth into thunder. Dancers spun in cloth, dyed the colors of fire and forest. The daughters of Umuagu arrived glittering with coral and gold, each one certain she would leave that day a future queen, and none more certain than Chinaza, who walked beside her mother as though the throne were already warm beneath her. And at the lowest edge of it all, behind the cooking fires, where the smoke stung her eyes, stood Nika in her faded wrapper, carrying gourds of water for guests who would not turn to look at her face. The ceremony began, and one by one the noble daughters were presented before Prince, and one by one they praised his strength and his future crown, and one by one he felt that old gray emptiness open inside his chest. He had heard every honeyed word 1,000 times. He knew the taste of a lie, dressed as love. Then, in the press of the crowd, a careless elbow drove hard into Nika's back. She stumbled forward, and the heavy gourd flew from her hands, and a long arc of cool water broke across the embroidered robe of the crown prince himself. The whole courtyard gasped as one. The drummers fell silent. Chinaza's lip curled in delight. "Seize her." Lady Adaku's voice cracked across the square like a whip. "Lay the rod on her until she remembers her place. This is the thief's daughter, my prince, the gutter child of a thief." 2 guards moved toward Nika, and every soul there waited for the cursed girl to throw herself down and beg. She lifted her chin, looked the prince full in the eyes, and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Forgive me, my prince. The fault was mine to carry, not yours to wear. Give me until the sun moves 1 hand's width, and I will have your robe washed and dried, and I will not run from the punishment after. But I will not weep for pity I have not earned, and I will not call myself a thief to please anyone here, because I am not one, and neither was my father." The courtyard went utterly still. No one spoke to a prince that way. No one in Umuagu spoke the truth that way. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Prince Obiora was not bored. He raised his hand, and the guards stopped where they stood. "Let her be," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the girl. "What is your name?" "Nika, my prince, daughter of Ikena." And at that name, Ikena, Panusu, who had crept to the edge of the festival, made a broken sound and sank to his knees in the dust, his hands shaking, his mouth moving on a word he did not dare to say aloud. The prince saw it. He saw, too, the way Lady Adaku's smooth face went the color of cold ash at the sound of a dead man's name. Time stopped. The drums stopped. Everything stopped. Why would the most powerful woman in all of Umuagu turn gray with fear at the sight of a girl who carried nothing but water? That night, the prince could not sleep. He lay in the dark of his chamber and listened to the palace breathe around him, and he could not push the picture from his mind. The way Lady Adaku's smooth and famous face had drained to the color of cold ash at the sound of a dead man's name. He had spent his whole life among people who wanted things, and he knew the shape of greed and the shape of pride and the shape of flattery worn like a mask. But what he had seen cross Adaku's face in that courtyard was none of those things. It was fear, and the powerful, he knew, are only ever truly afraid of one thing in this world: the truth, walking toward them in the light of day. So at first light, the prince did a thing no prince of Amwagu had done in living memory. He rose before his servant stirred, wrapped himself in a plain undyed cloth like a common man, and went out on foot, alone, to find it. He went first to the hut of the old landkeeper, who had guarded the boundary cords of the kingdom since before Obiora was born. The records of Amwagu were not written upon paper. They were carved into long staves of hard Iroko wood, one for every parcel of land in the 7 quarters, kept in cool dark rows, like sleeping elders. The prince asked for the stave of the Agbala Valley, the green and famous valley whose tall yams had made Lady Adaku the richest woman in the kingdom. The old keeper hesitated, and his hands trembled as he drew the stave down and blew the dust of years from its grooves. And when the prince read the mark cut deepest into the old wood, the breath left his body. For there, carved a full generation ago, and never once lawfully amended, was the boundary of the Agbala Valley, and beside it the name of the man to whom that land had belonged, not Adaku, Ikena. And below the name, a small worn carving, a little leaping fish. "This is no idle question, keeper," the prince said softly. "How does the valley of Ikena become the valley of Lady Adaku, with no mark of sale, no judgment of the elders, nothing carved here at all?" The old man would not lift his eyes. "My prince, I keep the wood. I have kept it faithfully for 40 years. But there are men who keep the wood, and there is a woman who has kept this whole village too afraid to read it. I carved no sale, because no sale was ever brought before me. One season Ikena held that valley. The next he was a thief and a dead man, and Lady Adaku's yams were rising green in his soil. And I was told kindly, the way a blade can be kind, that an old man who wished to grow older should carve nothing and ask nothing. At last he raised his eyes, and they were wet. I have waited 18 years for someone with no fear left in him to ask me that question. My prince, you are the first who ever has." That was the first true crack in the wall. And through it the prince glimpsed the edge of something vast and rotten. But a carving alone could not break a woman who had ruled for 30 years. He needed to stand where it had happened. So he walked to the far edge of the village, to a place the people of Amwagu would not go after dark, and murmured a prayer to pass even in daylight the burned-out ruin of a compound, swallowed now by elephant grass and creeping vine. 18 rains had softened, but the bones of it still stood, the blackened stumps of the wall posts, the collapsed shape of what had once been a family's home. The air there hung strangely cold for so hot a morning, and it smelled of wet ash and old smoke, as though the fire had gone out only the night before. The prince walked slowly through the high grass, and at the place where the gate had once stood he found the 2 gateposts still rooted in the earth, charred blacken around the base of each, half buried and red with rust, the broken links of an iron chain. A gate does not chain itself shut from the outside. He crouched there a long time, in the cold and the silence, while something inside his gentle heart hardened slowly into iron. And on the scorched lintel post above him, blackened but not destroyed, a careful hand had once carved a small leaping fish. "This was your home," the prince said aloud, to a man 18 years in his grave. "And they chained the gate. By the gods, Ikena, they chained the gate from the outside." That evening he went to Nika's leaning hut at the broken edge of the village, and he sat down on the bare swept floor like a common man, and he asked her to tell him about her father. Her whole face changed when she spoke of Ikena. It softened, it warmed. It filled with a love that 18 years of cruelty had never once managed to kill. She drew the broken staff from beneath her sleeping mat and laid the 2 halves in the prince's hands, the little leaping fish on the handle, worn smooth by her own thumb across the long years. "He used to lift me onto his shoulders in the yam fields at first light," she said, "so I could touch the leaves at the very top of the tallest vines. He smelled of earth and rain and palm oil. He had a laugh that began somewhere deep in his belly and shook the whole compound when it came." Her voice caught and steadied itself. "He told me that a man owns nothing in this world that he can truly keep, not his cattle, not his yam, not his land, nothing, nothing but his name, and he made me promise that I would keep mine clean, no matter what it ever cost me. Then one season he was simply gone, and they told me he was a thief, and they have not stopped telling me since." She looked up at the prince, and her eyes did not waver. But a man who teaches his small daughter that her name is the only thing in the world worth dying for does not creep into another man's barn to steal bronze. I have believed that alone, against the whole world, for 18 years, and I am not tired of believing it, my prince. I will believe it in my grave." For a long moment the prince could not find his voice. "Why do you not hate them?" he asked at last. "The whole village has given you nothing but cruelty since the day you were born. Why is there no hate in you?" "Because hate is a fire," Nika said simply, "and a fire always eats the house it lives in first. I have already lost my mother, and my father, and my name. I will not let them take my heart as well. That much, at least, is still mine to keep." And the prince, who had been flattered by 1,000 beautiful women and loved by not one of them, understood in that quiet moment that he had found the only holy true thing in all his kingdom. 18 o'clock the next morning he went looking for the why of it, and the why led him back to Panusu. But before the old man would say a word, he drew the prince behind his palm wine stand and dug beneath a flat stone in the earth, and brought up a bundle of oiled cloth gone stiff and dark with age. Inside lay a single market weight stone, carved with the king's own seal. "Your father gave me this the day before." "They called him a thief," Panwasu whispered. "It is one of Lady Ataku's own weights, the ones her traders used at market." Ekena carried it before the council of elders and set it against the true king's measure, and he showed them all that it was like that for years she had been robbing every trader in Umuagu, a little at a time, a theft so wide and so patient that no one had ever thought to catch it. The elders saw it with their own eyes, and she smiled at your father across that meeting. "Child, the way a woman smiles at a snake she has already decided to kill. He gave me this stone that same night, and he said, 'Nuasu, if anything should happen to me, this is the truth of it. Keep it safe.' 3 days later he was a thief. A week after that he was ash, and I have kept this stone buried in the ground for 18 years and let it rot my soul, because I was a coward who wanted to grow old. That was the why of it. And it was uglier than the prince had feared. A great woman had destroyed an honest man not for what he had, but for what he had seen. "Tell me how they did it," the prince said. "Her men crept into Ikena's barn in the dead of night and buried sacks of the king's tribute bronze beneath his seed yam," the old man said. "In the morning they came with half the village at their backs and found it. And they screamed thief, and everyone believed it, because she is great, and your father was only good. I saw them carry the sacks in. I saw their faces in the moonlight, and I said nothing, because I had a wife and small children, and I was afraid of a woman who could make an honest man vanish in a single season." He pressed his face into his shaking hands. "God forgive me, my prince. I have tapped my wine and drunk my own share of it every single night for 18 years, only so that I could close my eyes and sleep. But there was one more layer to it, the deepest and the cruelest of them all. And Pan Wasu gave it to the prince, in a voice that had gone almost to nothing. Branding him a thief took his land and his good name. But a disgraced man can still open his mouth and speak, and she knew it. So one night, not a month later, his compound caught fire in the dark, and the gate was found chained shut from the outside, and he did not come out of it. They called it a sorrow and an accident, and they buried it. His wife, Nika's mother, died within the year, of grief, of sickness, of a heart that had nothing left in this world to beat for, and the child they could not be seen to kill in the open. So they killed her slowly instead. Every harvest for 18 years, Lady Adaku has sent yam to the elders of this village, and in return they have kept that orphan in the dust, despised, watched, and crushed, so that no one would ever look upon her face and think to ask whose Valley Ogbala truly is. The cruelty you have seen done to that girl her whole life was never the carelessness of strangers, my prince. It was paid for, harvest after harvest. It was the slow and patient murder of a name. The prince stood in the falling dark, the chained gate and the buried waitstone and the broken staff all turning together in his mind. And for the first time in his gentle life, he understood what it was to want to see a powerful person brought low. But before he carried any of it to his father, he did one small and private thing. He took the 2 broken halves of Ikina's staff to the old palace smith, and he asked him quietly whether a thing so badly broken could ever be made whole again. The smith turned the pieces over in his scarred hands and was silent for a while. "Whole? No, my prince," he said at last. "What is broken stays broken. That is the way of things, but bound it can be, with good bronze worked hot into the break, so that it stands stronger at the wound than it ever was before it was hurt." The prince looked down at the little leaping fish for a long moment. "Then bind it," he said softly, "and make the binding beautiful." Approximately 22 o'clock for one bright moment, it truly seemed the long night was ending. At dawn the prince carried the carved stave, the Kingsil waitstone, and the whole of Panwasu's testimony before his father. Ezonwoha, who had grown old enough to grieve the wrongs of his own long reign, listened in a terrible silence, and then he wept, for he too had known Ikina in his youth and had believed the lie like all the rest. He rose, and before his startled council he set his own cloth of honor about Nika's thin shoulders. "Let the truth be tested before the full council of the 7 quarters," the old king declared, his voice thick. "But until that day, this daughter of Ikina sleeps under my roof as an honored guest, and not in the dust of any square. My son may court her freely and openly before the kingdom. We have carried a rotten thing in this house for 18 years, and by the gods, we will at last drag it into the light." It seemed finished. It seemed the great wrong was about to be made right at last. It was not, because Lady Adahu had ears in every chamber of that palace, and within the hour she struck back like a serpent that had only been pretending to sleep. While the court still buzzed with the news, her servants slipped into the guest chamber given to Nika and hid the late queen's own coral, a sacred royal heirloom, beloved of the whole kingdom, beneath the girl's sleeping mat. And by mid-morning Lady Adaku swept into the great hall with a dozen waiting witnesses and discovered it before them all, lifting the blood-red beads high above her head. "Behold your honored guest," she cried, her voice ringing to the rafters. "Not one night beneath the king's roof, and already the thief's daughter steals the dead queen's own coral from the royal store. Did I not warn you all? The blood does not lie. It steals because it is always stolen. Father to daughter, root to bitter fruit. I beg you, my king, cast this girl out, or give her to the law, before your bewitched son hands the whole future of Omuagu to a gutter thief who has clouded his young eyes." The hall erupted. The bought witnesses wailed, and swore they had seen the coral in the girl's own 2 hands. Chinaza wept prettily, and cried that she had always known it in her heart. And the council, who had feared Lady Adaku all their lives, began to mutter and to nod, for the theft of royal coral was death by the ancient law, and the prince's defense now carried the sound of a young man bewitched by a clever and a pretty face. Even the old king's certain brow clouded over with doubt. And just like that, the very same lie that had murdered the father reached out its cold hand for the daughter. Would a single soul in that hall believe a friendless water girl over the greatest woman in the kingdom? "You see how it is done," the prince said quietly to Nika in the eye of the storm. "This is the very thing they did to your father. The same lie, the same coward's blade slipped in the dark." "I know," Nika said, and though her hands trembled at her sides, her voice did not. "I have watched this story play out my whole life. I only never knew, until this very moment, that I had been born into the middle of it. And that same night, in the dark, Lady Adaku moved to bury the truth a second time, exactly as she had buried it the first. She sent 2 men to the landkeeper's hut, to take the carved stave of the Ogbala Valley and feed it to a cooking fire, and to find old P.A. Nuasu, and make certain his tongue never wagged again. Burn the wood, set Toltem pressing cold cowries into their palms, her voice as calm as still water, and the old drunkard has talked his last. Bring me the waitstone too, if he kept it. By morning there will be no proof left in this whole kingdom, but, my word, and my word has ruled Amwagu for 30 years, and it will rule it 30 more. But the prince had learned, at last, to listen at the edges of his own court, and he had set quiet guards in the shadows, around both the keeper's hut and the old man's stand. Could the truth survive until morning, or would Lady Adaku bury it a second time, as she had once buried Ikena, in his own chained and burning house? The men came in the deep of the night, and the prince's guards took them at the keeper's door with the carved stave already in their hands. Under the weight of what they had been caught doing, the two men broke before the sun was even up. They named the woman who had sent them. They told what they had come to burn, and whom they had come to silence. And when the frightened servant who had hidden the royal coral heard that the others had confessed, she fell to her knees, and confessed too that the coral had been placed beneath Nika's mat on Lady Adaku's own order, in her own words, with her own cold hand pointing the way. By the time the sun rose, the truth had a chain of living witnesses, and the king summoned the whole council, the noble houses, and the people of the village into the great hall to hear it. Lady Adaku stood at the center of that hall, and for the first time in 30 years, her smooth and famous face was afraid. The prince laid it all before the king and the people. The carved stave that named the Agbala Valley as Ikena's, the King's Waitstone that proved her years of quiet theft, the testimony of Panuwasu, the confession of the two men sent to burn the wood, and of the servant who had planted the queen's coral. And then he turned to Lady Adaku. "You wanted Ikena's valley, and he would not sell it to you," the prince said quietly. "He stood before the elders and showed them your false weights, and you could not forgive a small honest man for it. So you branded him a thief. You burned him in his own chained compound. And for 18 years you paid a whole village to grind his orphan daughter into the dirt, so that no one would ever ask the question I ask this week, do you deny it?" "First," she denied. "Lies!" Lady Adaku cried, lifting her chin. "Every word of it, lies. I have given this kingdom 30 years of my life. I know nothing of any fire, or any planted bronze. This is a lovesick boy and a clever gutter girl, spinning a tale between them, and you would believe it over me." Then, when the king's face did not soften, she deflected. "And what does an old carving prove? Land changes hands in every kingdom under the sky. Will you shame a noble house on the word of a drunkard who taps palm wine for his supper, and a water girl already caught with the dead queen's own coral in her bed?" But the old king lifted his hand, and the two men were brought forward, and the trembling servant with them, and one by one they spoke her name aloud before all the gathered people, and the strength began to go out of Lady Adaku's shoulders. So at last she admitted a piece of it. "Perhaps," she said, and her voice turned cold as riverstone, "perhaps the valley was once Ikena's. Perhaps I took what I took. Land goes to those who are strong enough to hold it. It was 18 years ago. The man is dust." "And the fire," the king said, his voice terrible and low. "The gate chained shut from the outside. The child you paid a whole village to torment for 18 years. And then Lady Adaku justified it, and in the justifying she showed the whole hall the black thing she truly was. "I did what greatness requires," she snapped, and her eyes blazed with a cold and ancient pride. "Ikena was a small, stubborn man who stood in the road of a great house with his little, honest face, and the strong are meant to remove what the weak put in their way. That is the only law that has ever ruled this world, or any other. I made my house the greatest in all Umi. As for his whelp," she turned her cold gaze upon Nika, "she should have had the sense to die quietly in the gutter where I left her. Everything she has suffered. She suffered because she would not have the simple decency to disappear." The hall went utterly silent, and then Nika stepped forward. For 18 years she had swallowed her words while they spat upon her. She did not swallow them now. "You are right about one thing," she said, and her voice did not shake. "The strong take what the weak cannot hold. You taught this whole village to do it to me, every single day of my life. But hear me now. Lady Ada, strength that can only feed on the helpless is not strength at all. It is the deepest cowardice there is, dressed up in coral and in gold. You feared one honest farmer so much that you burned him alive in his own house. You feared his memory so much that you spent 18 years at war with his orphan child. You feared a broken old palm wine tapper so much that you sent men with knives into the night. A truly strong person has nothing to fear from the truth. You have been terrified of it for 18 years. You did not steal my father's valley. You stole your own name, your own peace, your own honor, and you have been the poorest woman in all of Umawagu ever since. No matter how tall your stolen yams have grown, no one breathed. The old king's eyes were wet, and he rose slowly to his feet. "Lady Adaku," he said, his voice like distant thunder rolling in from the hills, "you will stand before the full council of the 7 quarters, and you will answer for the man you burned and the child you tried to bury alive in the dust of her own village. There is no house in this kingdom great enough to hide what you have done. If this story is moving you, subscribe now. The ending will change how you see everything." The judgment came 3 days later, beneath the great silk cotton tree, where the 7 quarters of Umawagu had gathered for 100 years. The council heard every witness. They read the carved stave aloud, so that the whole village could hear with their own ears whose land Ogbala had always been. They set the false weightstone against the king's true measure, and watched it come up light, exactly as Akina had shown them 18 years before. They listened to the confessions, and when it was done, they stripped Lady Adaku of her title, her wealth, her place among the noble houses, and the green Ogbala Valley she had killed an honest man to steal. Her daughter Chinaza's long cherished claim upon the prince fell to dust along with her mother's name. The valley was returned, by the king's own word, to Nika, not as a gift, but as the rightful inheritance of Aikina's only living child. And Lady Adaku, the woman who had ruled Umawagu for 30 years, was cast out to the poorest edge of the kingdom, to live the rest of her days in the very dust she had condemned an innocent girl to for 18 years. Then the old king turned to the village that had mocked Nika her whole life, and his voice carried to the farthest edge of the crowd. "Hear me. For 18 years you have called this girl the thief's daughter. You will never call her that again. Her father Ikena was an honest man, the most honest among you, and you let a powerful woman's lie put him in his grave, and then you spat upon his child. Today his name is cleared before all of you, under this tree, in the light of day. Look at her well. You owe her more than you will ever be able to repay." Then the old palace smith stepped forward, carrying something wrapped in white cloth, and he placed it gently into the prince's hands. And the prince carried it across the silence to Nika. It was her father's broken staff, this snapped walking stick she had guarded beneath her sleeping mat for 18 lonely years. Made whole again, the two halves, bound together with a band of shining bronze, worked hot into the break. The little leaping fish polished until it caught and held the morning sun. And as the prince laid her father's mended staff into her 2 open hands, before the whole kingdom, before every person who had ever thrown ash upon her head and called her cursed Nika, who had not wept once in all her long years of suffering, finally bowed her head over the staff and wept like the first rain coming home to the cracked red earth. And then Prince Obiora knelt in the dust before her, the despised orphan, the water girl, the thief's daughter, and took her hand, and spoke so that the whole kingdom would hear it. "I did not choose you because of a valley, or a cleared name, or anything you might one day be," he said. "I chose you on the day you stood before me, soaked and friendless, with a whipping waiting behind you, and you still would not call yourself a thief to save your own skin. In a kingdom full of people who would lie to be loved, you would not lie even to be spared. That is the only nobility I have ever wanted, standing beside my throne. Marry me, Nika, daughter of Ikena, not so that you may rise above these people who wronged you, but so that this whole kingdom may finally learn from you what an honest heart is truly worth." Nika lifted her father's mended staff toward the village that had buried his name in lies, and she did not raise her voice in triumph. She only said the words that would be repeated beneath that silk cotton tree for generations yet to come. "You threw me in the dust, and you called it justice, but the dust could never touch the one thing my father left me. And today, at last, the truth has come home for its own. When the rains came again that year, they fell soft and steady upon a kingdom that had been changed forever. Nika married Prince Obiora beneath the great silk cotton tree, and the very village that had once emptied ash over her head now lined the roads to bless her name. But she did not build her new life around her own comfort. She took the green Ogbala Valley that her father had died for, and she made it flourish again. And then she did a thing no noble of Umiagu had ever done before her. She opened its harvest to the poorest people in the kingdom, and into a wide new compound. At the valley's edge she gathered every orphaned and outcast, and falsely shamed child the 7 quarters had thrown away. No child in Umuagu would ever again be branded for a sin invented by someone richer than their dead parents. That was the first law she made, and she made it with her own mouth, standing on her father's land, his mended staff planted in the earth beside her like a living thing. Pianuosu lived out his last years, not as a haunted old drunkard at the edge of the market, but as an honored elder of the valley. The worm of his long silence finally lifted from his heart. He would sit in the cool shade of Aikina's land and tell the children who gathered at his knee the true story of the most honest man he had ever known, and of the brave girl who would not lie even to save her own life. As for Lady Adaku, she lived out her days exactly where she had condemned an innocent child to live alone, poor and forgotten. At the cold edge of the kingdom she had once ruled. Sometimes, the traders said, she would stand at the boundary of the 7 quarters and look out toward the green Ogbala Valley, now heavy with grain that fed the very people she had despised, and then she would turn and walk back into the dust, with no one left to bow to her and no one left to so much as speak her name. And Prince Obiora, who had once believed that every smile he was ever given was a lie reaching for his crown, had found the one person in all the world who would not lie to him, even to save her own life. He carried that for the rest of his reign. When at last he became king, the people of Umagu said there had never been a ruler who listened harder to the poor, or who was slower to believe a powerful man's word against a humble one, because he had learned from a girl who had nothing that the loudest voice in the village is very often the one with the most to hide. The village had mocked the poor orphan. Then the prince chose her as his bride, and in the end, the whole kingdom learned the lesson she had carried in her quiet heart all along. A lie may rule a village for a season, but the truth owns every season that comes after. Thank you for joining us for this story. Subscribe to Untold African Folktale Stories and click the bell so you never miss a story. Watch our next story here.